My name is Martin Pichelmeier, which is impossible to pronounce, maybe don't even try it. It's a name that comes from Austria. I was actually born around 62 kilometers from Arnold Schwarzenegger, from where he was born. I sound gladly slightly different, of course I also have Austrian accent, but less of it, I hope. I work for companies or am active in contexts that have black and white logos. One of them is called Broken Rules, which is a small independent games studio. One of them is the Copenhagen Game Collective. And one of them, my main job definitely, is the IT University of Copenhagen. Before that, so I moved to Denmark from Austria, and before that I've done a PhD in computer science, and I've been teaching games for 15 years. All in all, because even when I was mainly working in the company, I always had a little bit of a game design course on the side. And today's talk is kind of rooted in this long time of teaching and long time of learning also to teach games. At Broken Rules, we make small indie games, as I said. Has anyone played Oldman's Journey? Or maybe, yeah, that's us. I mean, not me, but my company, my colleagues. It was good. We make small boutique indie games, totally independent, very anarchic. It's a very good place. In the Copenhagen Game Collective, that is maybe also known to some, we make weird games and weird events, weird showcases at serious conferences, like the Nordic Game Conference is up next, and we've been co-organizing or helping out with Indicate Europe for years and things like that. We are just trying to push against what games can be in society or as a medium, basically. In my research, I don't know, I am a computer scientist, but I have done, among other things, media art for a while, and I'm somehow in the moment super interested in creative computing and that direction of thinking, which means that I have made a lot of Twitter bots recently. One of them, or the one that I'm most happy with, is actually called 5 Sparrows on a Vampire. That was generated by the bot itself. It named itself that way, or I decided that that's his name. It's a cooking bot that tells you what to cook, how to cook it, and also sometimes how to eat it, and to use your oldest knives and eat in the dark and with friends and so on. It's a challenge. It's kind of a game. Speaking of cooking, this talk is actually meant to, like, if you look at this image, this is beetroot in bread crust, which is a very which are very usual ingredients, actually, but this unique combination of focusing the taste of the beetroot and allowing you to focus on a specific thing is a very sophisticated way of exploring a taste. And that is a bit how I wanted to frame today's talk. That is like, I'm not going to teach you anything super groundbreaking and new, but maybe I give you a perspective to see what you're doing in a new light. New Nordic game design teaching, basically. I'm also not a fan of TED Talks, actually. If I ever should do a rant on TED Talks, hire me, because I don't like things that simplify, presentations that simplify contexts. I think it's much more, for me personally, it's just much more rewarding to see the complexity of human life, or the complexity on this planet. So it's going to be tough. I was also told to never make any excuses before giving a talk, so I'm doing exactly that. Well, let's get the formality out of the way. Context. So the context from which I'm speaking is the IT University in Copenhagen. And we have had the games program for quite some time, since 2005. It's only a master program, so we have no bachelor students. We have 2 tracks, the technology track and it's called design track, but it is much more a design and production track in practice, because you don't need 20 new game designers in Denmark every year. We take in 50 students, which is, I don't know if that is a lot or little, depends on your, I mean, yeah. We take in 50 students. So that means we have around 100, 110 students around at any point in time. We get a lot of applications, and as I said, it's in Denmark. Denmark is a country of, I think, 5.5 million inhabitants, so it's super tiny. And we have, Lego and Unity are Danish companies, so we have two big players that have offices in Denmark, but apart from that, we don't have a lot of game developers, so our education cannot be a pipeline into AAA, because there is virtually no AAA industry. Malmö, on the other side of the ocean, just an hour away, has a far more games industry than Denmark. Well, and of course, we are a state-owned university. So our goals are maybe different to some universities here. It's a very European perspective I'm bringing. Sorry about that. We have, I will not go through the full curriculum, but it's like we have, of course, mandatory parts and elective parts. It's normal thing, but I want to focus on instead is the course I've been teaching last semester. That was, after 15 years, the first time I actually got a course about making games right. I have been teaching that with Miguel, by the way, who is sitting back there, and Lena Mech, credit whom credit is due, and actually Miguel was very influential on the structure of the course. We have been, this course is kind of the result of, well, long years of teaching, but also the result of putting a number of existing courses together and just taking the best bits. And I think one can learn something from that. What I do first is we have 4 weeks of game jamming. People get assignments. I will talk about that later in more detail. We have a lecture part where where students are classically taught, basically. Well, it's more a workshop thing, and they work a lot and they make small prototypes. And then we have a 6 in last semester, due to how the autumn break was 7 weeks, group project that led to the most fascinating games I have ever seen from first semester students. It might, of course, be that we somehow got the admission process right and just have the best students ever, and my course is as just as usual, but these 2 examples are Chain Rule and Forgotten. One is a resource combination game that is really novel in what it does, and the other one is an Alzheimer's simulator that is an extremely research-based experiment in putting you into the shoes of someone with Alzheimer's, and it actually helped me understand what my grandmother was going through. In a weird way, and everyone who plays it has kind of, everyone knows someone who has been through a process of mental deterioration. Extremely interesting results, especially for first semester students that work together for the first time and do something in 7 weeks. And I think one of the reasons why the results were better is that we somehow made this system so that they can explore the concept of taste. Taste it's not a simple concept, and I will give a little bit of combination contextualization for that in a second. But it is a kind of sophistication that wasn't there before, and I hope that has to do with the setup of our class. The famous Frank Lantz quote that making games combine is like making operas out of bridges is, for me, the starting point. It is a very interesting quote, but of course, what we want to teach them is actually make excellent bridges and exquisite operas, because if you've ever been to the opera, you know that not all operas are entirely entertaining. But it's, of course, possible to make an entertaining opera, or a sophisticated opera at least. I found, well, there are a couple of books about taste, actually, but one of the most important little texts about taste is by David Hume. Funnily, he only published it because his publisher was asking for an additional text in the book, because then it had enough pages to be published, and that's the reason why it actually got out there. Mechanical necessities, I guess. But he has a very interesting attitude towards taste in saying that it is something, an immediate and spontaneous reaction to something, or a reaction of approval or disapproval, but it can be developed, it can be learned. You can, if you understand the subject matter at hand better, then you can become better at taste. Now, he was writing about critics, and not so much about creators, and I think the taste of creating something, the necessary for creating something, is a little bit different from the taste you need in order to judge something as a critic. They're related, but they're maybe not the same. There are more modern takes on taste. One of them is Sara Ahmed, who sees taste more or less as something that is intersubjective, so it's not the subjective opinion of one person, it's more or less the alignment between one person and others that have good taste, whatever good means in that context. There is maybe some truth to that if you look at games like Hypnospace Outlaw that definitely are tasteful from a Curiosity's perspective, 90s internet perspective. But if you look at the same game from a different perspective, then then this image doesn't look tasteful, maybe. So taste is context, taste is maybe something like an agreement between people. It's not a simple topic. Richard Rorty says that good poetry is about identifying and selecting metaphors that stimulate the audience. And I think this is something we actually do as designers. But maybe also, I mean, when it comes to code, then at least when it's close to gameplay, we also do that. We also stimulate the audience. And there is a certain level of metaphorical aspect to, I don't know, how movement works and so on. So in the end, I think this kind of the tasteful creation can extend to other areas than just design, and it can inform every aspect of your creation. Well, and you can hopefully develop a certain sensitivity, a certain understanding of the medium, and get better at the ability of selecting the right metaphors. How? That is the question. Because I don't know, because I was just in a very esoteric mood, I picked the metaphor of alchemy for framing a couple of strategies that can help in developing this kind of tastefulness of this kind of sense of taste of students. Not an arbitrary pick, actually a very usual one. You use some kind of framing that helps you in packaging things in a more easier to communicate way. Alchemy is a super interesting topic, by the way. I had about 10 slides here about alchemy that I cut because it was like longer than the rest of the talk. I'm not going to do the alchemy training. Suffice it to say that it's super interesting how a proto-scientific endeavor informed modern science in a very strange way. Newton was, by the way, a big fan of alchemy. He was totally out for the Philosopher's Stone and things like that. So, interesting. Let's talk about other interesting things. The transformative process of alchemy. So alchemy is like, traditionally it's about making gold, but then it was always seen as this kind of more the philosophy of change as a process that makes you into something that is more yourself or more valuable, maybe only to yourself. I'm going to present now seven stages or 7 techniques, 7 ways of how to work with students that I called stages, but that doesn't mean that they are serial. It can also be that they kind of overlap. So the first one is decompression. Decompression is a cleansing process. It's about decrusting the brain. It's what we do in these first weeks with students, where we try to have them get stuck ideas out of their system. And at the same time also, of course, try to make them work together. We give them 4 super concrete assignments and a little bit of teaching in 4 specific areas of game making, from a classical design challenge to a puzzle script challenge, which is a nice low barrier for people that have never coded before to write code. If you haven't heard of puzzle script, please Google it. It's very good as a tool for education, in my opinion. We let them play around with Unity a little bit, also to make them less frightened of it and so on. And we let them make a game in public space with the idea that it also makes them more open to actually go out there with what they have, because there is a lot of user testing that I will talk about in a second. The way we do this is, if you have 60 students in a room, then of course you cannot have presentations, weekly presentations of every single one. So the system we have implemented last time that worked brilliantly is that we assign pairs. So they work together in a pair, but everyone has its own deliverable, and they get assigned by us those pairs, and we always pair up someone who has more tech understanding with someone who has less. And they also present to each other and get peer critique, and that way we are just very efficient of giving everyone feedback, and at the same time they know each other, so when they form groups in order to work together later, they already know with whom they can communicate and with whom they want to work. Works very well. Stage 2, decomposition. What we also focus on a lot is prototyping. Decomposition is the thought of developing an understanding as a student of how the whole correlates to its parts. And prototyping is a very good tool of testing out exactly these relationships and of finding these kernels that you can grow into the whole thing. As you can see here in this wonderful diagram, prototyping can be used in all areas, from super technical to the look and feel, to also what role will this game play for people and so on. We force them, or we encourage them to make a lot of prototypes while they're working. Reflection. What we do since the teaching only happens actually in more or less a couple of weeks, roughly in the middle of the whole project, we kind of pad the course with inviting a lot of speakers from other areas while they're working on their project, like people that work in the industry, but also a psychologist that has been talking about game addiction and things like that, in order to give them the ability to understand that what they're making is connected to so many fields out there. Perspectivation. What we also try to make from the beginning a part of their practice is that we teach them to get used to getting feedback on unfinished things and on things that are dear to them. As you might know, maybe especially if you have your own creative practice, it is an extremely tough thing to get feedback, and it is really, at least for me personally, always super frightening. But it is a necessary lesson to learn how to actually work with feedback, how to elicit feedback, how to structure a formal user test, but also a super informal test where you just want to find out if you are on the right track. The problem being, of course, that all kinds of feedback have, it's a very hard learning process in all kinds of feedback to separate between what is said and what is actually meant and what you can actually take away from it. And at the same time, practical problems like, is it clear what is supposed to happen in the game, or is it a matter of the interface being broken, or is a game mechanic inadequate, or just does it not fit in a specific situation? Feedback is not easy to learn, but we kind of, the structure in this class, and I would, is basically that we add as many opportunities and layers of feedback as in any way possible. So they have to pitch before guests in order to get their project through. They have an exhibition at the end. In their exam, we have an external examiner. They get supervision. They have to present several, we actually have a beta presentation and a kind of final presentation in the class to get feedback from the teachers, but also from their peers. In the game jamming, they get peer criticism, and we have them hand in a user test protocol in the end. So layers of feedback. Another thing that works extremely well in education is it's something I played with for many years, is how to get constraints into the design, but also into the technical aspect of game development, because constraints are one of those. I mean, in reality out there, you face so many constraints that you cannot decide on yourself. But in university, I think it is very important to learn to make your own constraints as a student. So we try to make them pick constraints. Over the years, I also tried assigning constraints, like you have to make a 2D game, you have to make a game without health bars, I don't know. But we kind of guide them to making their own constraints, and it has been so that students actually really they just got better at picking very useful constraints, and sometimes they even go overboard with that, and it is usually a very good thing for them. Well, constraints help in, the thing is, if you look, this is one of my favorite graphs about game development in general, Daniel Cook's visualization of the creative process. It is applicable to any process, actually, of creative nature. The thing with constraints is, if you constrain yourself, it actually helps you to keep this expansive phase where your project gets bigger and bigger under control. There are a lot of tools out there, like user testing and also, I don't know, unit testing, things like that, that help you in the phase, the consolidation phase, but constraints help you in the expansive phase. Extremely useful. Cooperation. We put a lot of effort into making it possible that that diversity is seen as an asset by the students. So we are a very international program, a very mixed program. People come with a lot of different backgrounds. And they should really learn to use that as an important resource. And the way we do that is actually by not having them assume specific roles in development, but instead having them assume specific responsibilities and distribute accountability also in a slightly more granular fashion, because they work in small teams. They cannot have someone who is the game designer, but they can have someone who is actually has the last word on design decisions. It's a bit difficult. The problem with that is roles have so many issues out there, and I always have a super hard time teaching them because they are different from company to company. If you look at what writers and narrative designers do, it's super unpredictable from company to company. It's always different. They have to be accepted somehow, and who can accept a game designer role? It's very hard to get that through that you're the game designer, but it is actually, in my opinion, in my experience actually, it's possible to get through with I have the last say on design decisions, or a specific part of design decisions maybe. And the final problem, my biggest problem with roles is always, you cannot teach them because people have to execute a role in order to learn what it actually encompasses. But at that moment, when they actually understand it, you don't have to teach it anymore to a certain degree. So there is no point in the life of a student where you can ever successfully teach them to assume a specific role. Maybe that's all not true for some roles like project management and so on. I think those are easier to teach. Finally, the final building block for this is the analysis stage that comes at the end. We have all students, that includes those with a computer science bachelor that study game technology, which is more computer science for games than any other kind of curriculum. We have all of them write an academic reflection on what they have created. So instead of having them write some kind of diary or journal about their development, we actually demand a reflection on an aspect of their game that is based on what they have been learning in the theoretical part of the whole class, which kind of with the intention of giving them a point where they have to reflect on what they're actually working with, where they have to take this step back and contextualize their learning. Okay, that's basically it. There is, of course, much more. I have no idea if we have found gold. I hope we have found gold. In what I have learned from teaching that class, and what is my understanding, is that it is extremely hard to give students the freedom to learn by themselves. And I think the framing that we have in this course is kind of helping with that. The overall structure supports it better than anything I have ever seen. And I always hope that it is actually helping them to understand that their game has a certain soul, a certain core, a certain heart that they can listen to. And I think, at least I have the impression that this approach of homing in on that from several angles helps them to get to a state where they are actually able to listen to that. Yes, I have references because I'm an academic. Do you have questions? If you do, there's a microphone over there.
Yes, so I teach in the Netherlands, in Breda, and we have a very similar structure to yours. But interestingly, I think we are focused on sort of getting students into the AAA industry, and we teach a lot of processes for design, a lot of structure. And I'm kind of struggling at the moment to find ways to get students to kind of get weird, really, to kind of use what you were saying earlier. You know, in training them to be professional and organized, the result is they hit that point of being kind of risk averse by the time they graduate. So would you have any advice for, you know, how do we inject that sort of personal, soulful approach without losing too much professionalism?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, actually. I'm quite familiar with your program. Mata is in Bremen
Yes,
too. Yeah, yeah.
yes.
So I've once been to a presentation with him, and he has talked about his program. But about mine, and I think it's like 180 degrees, because the Netherlands actually has a AAA industry. And you are obviously educating for a very different career. So I do not know if there is, it's like, I think it's not like there is one right solution. I think what we are trying to do is really make a very empowering education that can allow you to work in games and then also apply that knowledge in areas that are somehow connected to games. And the way we do it, I think actually that the trick is really this phase, the lecture phase in the middle, where we just generalize game development very much, and where we really challenge them to think outside the box. And we just try to push them a little bit out of their comfort zone. And we also invite some speakers that are guest lecturers that are sometimes from very left field game developers, so that I think also helps. And also what they just experience in Copenhagen, because it's a quirky scene, but...
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, just to follow up on that, can you give us some examples of where your students went after graduating? Basically, they're not necessarily going into the AAA industry, then what? Where do they go? What do they do?
So it's not like we don't have people in the AAA industry. One of the lead designers at Massive working on The Division is one of our graduates, and IO is run by, who make Hitman, is run by someone who has studied in our program. So I think he hasn't finished, so maybe I shouldn't use him as an example. But in general, I mean, funnily, so I've been talking about this game tells you things, and I bumped into two former students a few days ago in Copenhagen. They're now here on the third floor showing their game in the mega booth, and they said, yeah, this is exactly what we were saying in an interview a few days ago. The game anyway tells us what to do. So I think a lot of them try to become independent game developers. A lot of them get hired by the local industry, including Malmö, which is really just half an hour and 45 minutes away. A lot of them actually also seem to slowly drift out of game development once they have kids and need to have a better paid job, actually, I guess. And then they go to all kinds of places. Like one is working for a bank to increase the retention of interaction with their online systems and things like that, where this skill set that we are teaching is super applicable.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi there. I'm Tim Flusk from University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I was specifically wondering if you could maybe elaborate on what kind of examples you use to inspire students into where the boundaries of games are. Sort of like you say, you bring in psychologists and game designers from left field, but rather I guess the question is, where are sort of the blocking points for the students that you need to get these kind of speakers to actually break that kind of boundary so they can actually be inspired and explore?
So the question is where the blocking points are that would hold them back from and where the boundaries of games are. I think it's very much a matter of perspective, isn't it, somehow? I think one of the problems is that a lot of students come and they actually study games in order to realize a project that is born out of their love for specific genres or specific games. And that is something that is always super problematic, because they want to make the better League of Legends or Hearthstone or whatever, something very... and not very, well, actually both of those have been innovative in a weird way, but they have very little frame of reference. So more than my class is actually another class which is called Games and Culture, and that teaches them a canon of games and a broader view on games with very game studies focused. I think they can expand their understanding, or they have to expand their understanding of games very rapidly in the beginning, and then they find those borders themselves. I don't. That was not a very good answer. I'm sorry.
It was a vague question in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're done anyway. If If anyone has more questions, I'm here. Thank you.